The soft hum of the Seattle suburbs usually calmed Chloe Bennett. The tall cedar trees lining their quiet cul-de-sac, the distant rush of traffic on the nearby highway, the warm, natural light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their modern single-family home. This was the life she'd always dreamed of with Lucas. At 29, 8 weeks into her first pregnancy, she'd spent 2 years building a quiet, stable marriage, working part-time as a freelance graphic designer from the sunlit home office down the hall. But for the past 14 days, none of it felt peaceful. Not with Margaret Bennett living under their roof. Lucas had left for a week-long client conference in Southern California 2 weeks prior, a routine work trip for his regional sales director role. His mother had showed up unannounced the next morning, suitcase in hand, claiming she wanted to check on the new mom-to-be and keep the house running while her son was away. Chloe hadn't had the heart to turn her away. She never did. Conflict had always terrified her, especially the kind that seeped into family bonds. She'd grown up believing silence kept love intact, that flexibility and gratitude were the mark of a good wife and daughter-in-law. But Margaret's idea of caring was nothing short of suffocating control. It had started small, the way passive cruelty always does. First, she'd emptied the refrigerator of Chloe's favorite pre-portioned salads and frozen grain bowls, dismissing her carefully curated prenatal diet as trendy nonsense that won't nourish my grandbaby. She'd replaced them with heavy, rich home-cooked meals Chloe's sensitive pregnancy stomach couldn't tolerate, ignoring every quiet protest. Next came the rules. No working past 4 in the afternoon. No scrolling social media on her phone. No meeting her best friend for weekend coffee. No ordering takeout of any kind. Margaret monitored her screen time, commented on every minute of her day, and brushed off Chloe's visible exhaustion as simple laziness. Chloe's pregnancy fatigue had hit hard those first few weeks. Constant dull nausea, bone-deep tiredness, frequent lightheaded spells, but Margaret refused to acknowledge it. "I worked full-time through both of Lucas's pregnancies," she'd snap while wiping down the kitchen counters, her tone sharp and unyielding. "I never lay around complaining like this. Young women these days have no stamina, no discipline." Each comment chipped away at Chloe's confidence, leaving her feeling incompetent, ungrateful, and utterly alone in her own home. Worst of all was the isolation. Margaret subtly discouraged Chloe from contacting anyone outside the house, insisting her sole focus should be resting for the baby. She'd answer Chloe's personal calls for her, tell friends Chloe was swamped and unable to chat, and even deleted a few scheduled prenatal yoga class reminders from Chloe's calendar, claiming group classes were unsanitary and reckless for an early pregnancy. Day by day, Chloe's small, gentle routine dissolved. She stopped reaching out to her friends, stopped sharing her struggles, and started crafting perfect lies for Lucas's nightly text check-ins. Every night, Lucas would text asking how she was holding up, if his mother was being helpful, if she needed anything at all. And every night, Chloe replied with the same warm, harmless lines. "We're doing great. Mom's keeping me company. House is perfect. Don't worry about us. Have a good night." She'd type the words through blurred eyes, sitting alone in their quiet living room after Margaret had gone to bed, too afraid of breaking his heart to tell him the truth. Lucas adored his mother. He'd spoken of her his whole life as a selfless, devoted parent who'd sacrificed everything for him. Chloe couldn't bear to be the wife who turned him against the woman he worshipped. She'd convinced herself she could endure 2 more weeks, that she could outlast Margaret's visit, that peace would return once Lucas came home for good. She'd planned to hold on just a little longer, but life unraveled fast on that gray Wednesday afternoon. Chloe was slumped on the living room couch, her laptop open and forgotten on her lap, a wave of nausea rolling over her. She'd skipped lunch that day after Margaret had criticized her portion size, calling her selfish for starving the baby to stay thin. Her head throbbed. Her hands trembled, and hot, tired tears had begun spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. She'd tried to hide it, wiping her face quickly, but Margaret had walked into the room and seen her anyway. Instead of concern, Margaret's expression hardened into cold disapproval. The 58-year-old retired private school administrator carried herself with the crisp, unforgiving poise of someone who'd spent decades judging others' choices. She stopped in front of the couch, arms crossed over her tailored blazer, her voice sharp and biting in the quiet room. "Are you crying again?" Margaret asked, her tone laced with disdain. "Really, Chloe? This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're far too sensitive for motherhood. You let a little tiredness overwhelm you. You mope around the house all day, and now you're crying over nothing. How do you expect to raise a healthy, stable child if you can't even manage your own emotions?" Chloe's throat tightened, fresh tears flooding her eyes. She tried to speak, her voice small and shaky. "I'm sorry. I'm just really tired. Pregnancy's been harder than I thought it would be," Margaret scoffed, shifting her weight dismissively. Everyone gets tired during pregnancy. I did it alone while working full-time. You have a beautiful home, a supportive husband, no real responsibilities, and still you find reasons to complain. You're just ungrateful. Lucas works himself ragged to give you this perfect life, and you spend your days wallowing instead of appreciating it. The words cut deeper than any argument ever could. Chloe had spent months trying to be the perfect wife, trying to fit into Lucas's polished, high-achieving family, trying to earn Margaret's approval. In that moment, all her quiet effort felt worthless. She bowed her head, shoulders shaking, unable to defend herself. Trapped in the home she was supposed to feel safest in, she didn't hear the front door unlock, didn't catch the soft click of the deadbolt, or the quiet thud of a duffel bag hitting the hardwood entryway floor. She was too busy fighting back quiet sobs, too overwhelmed by the weight of 2 weeks of unspoken cruelty to notice anything beyond the harsh words stinging her chest. Lucas stood frozen in the doorway. His client's final meeting had canceled abruptly that morning, leaving his conference schedule empty. He'd wasted no time packing his bags and driving straight home, eager to surprise his pregnant wife after 2 weeks apart. He'd daydreamed all drive long about walking in to find her smiling, maybe baking something sweet, curled up on the couch waiting for him, the peaceful home he'd left behind. What he found instead was his wife in tears, trembling on their couch while his mother stood over her, criticizing her with a coldness he'd never seen directed at anyone, let alone his vulnerable pregnant wife. The room went completely silent. Margaret turned first, her expression shifting in an instant, hard disapproval melting into warm, practiced concern, the kind she used for church acquaintances and old family friends. She smoothed her blazer, forcing a gentle smile. "Lucas, you're home early," she said brightly, her voice suddenly soft and caring. "I wasn't expecting you for days. I was just checking on Chloe, sweet thing. She's been a little emotional today, that's all." Chloe's head shot up, her tear-streaked face flushing with pure panic. She scrambled to wipe her cheeks, her eyes wide with shame and fear. This was the one thing she'd begged herself to avoid, the one secret she'd fought to protect. Lucas wasn't supposed to see her like this, broken, defeated, bullied in their own home by the mother he trusted completely. Lucas didn't move. His gaze skipped right past his mother's fake smile, locking entirely on Chloe. He saw the red rims of her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands, the way she was hunching inward like she was bracing for more pain. He saw the empty water glass beside her, the untouched laptop, the exhausted slump of her shoulders that no amount of texted reassurance could ever hide. In that single heartbeat, everything clicked. All the vague texts about quiet days and easy rest, all the times she'd brushed off his offers to call and check in, all the small, unspoken distances she'd kept while he was away. None of it was peace. It was survival. Every sweet, reassuring message she'd sent him had been a lie. Not a lie of malice, but a lie of love. She'd been suffering alone this entire time, too afraid to burden him, too loyal to break his family apart. The warm, perfect image of his mother and his peaceful home that Lucas had carried his whole life cracked wide open. Nothing about the last 2 weeks had been fine. Nothing about this moment was okay. As Margaret continued to chatter softly, trying to smooth over the tension and frame herself as a caring guardian, Lucas stood motionless in the doorway. His quiet, unshakable naivety, his lifelong belief that his mother could do no wrong was gone in an instant. And the peaceful, uncomplicated marital life he and Chloe had built would never, ever be the same again. Lucas finally stepped forward after that long, paralyzed silence in the doorway, his duffel bag still heavy in his grip. The sound of his shoes against the hardwood floor cut through Margaret's overly cheerful chatter, and the artificial warmth in the room deflated instantly. He set his bag down slowly, his eyes never leaving Chloe's red, puffy face, his chest tight with a mix of guilt, confusion, and quiet anger he'd never felt toward his mother before. For 31 years, he'd known Margaret as steady, generous, endlessly devoted, someone who only ever loved fiercely. But the version of her standing in his living room minutes ago, sharp-tongued and unforgiving toward his vulnerable wife, was a stranger. "What happened?" Lucas asked, his voice low and calm, lacking any of the warmth his mother was used to hearing. It was not a greeting, nor a gentle inquiry. It was a demand for honesty. Margaret moved quickly to regain control of the moment, stepping away from the couch and folding her hands neatly in front of her, shifting into her most convincing maternal demeanor. "Nothing at all, honey. Chloe's just been overwhelmed lately. Early pregnancy mood swings, that's all it is. I was simply trying to talk her through it, to help her adjust. She's never been the best at handling stress, and I didn't want you to come home worried about her." Chloe flinched at the revision of events, her fingers twisted tightly in the hem of her soft sweater, her throat burning with unspoken words. She wanted to defend herself, to list every small cruelty of the past 2 weeks, the stolen meals, the unfair rules, the constant criticism, but old habits held her back. She hated fighting. She hated being the reason for tension between Lucas and his mother. Even after everything she'd endured, a quiet part of her still hoped they could fix this without a war. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, silent and defeated. Lucas noticed the flinch. He noticed how she shrank inward the second Margaret spoke, how her shoulders tensed like she was waiting for another correction, another lecture. It was a subtle, involuntary reaction, but it told him more than any argument ever could. His wife had been conditioned to shrink in her own home, and the realization made his stomach turn. She was crying, Lucas said plainly. "That's not just mood swings, Mom. What have you been doing while I was gone?" Margaret's smile faltered for the first time, her polished composure cracking at the edges. She let out a soft, exasperated sigh, shaking her head like she was dealing with an ungrateful child rather than her adult son. "Lucas Bennett, I cannot believe you're questioning me after I dropped everything to come help. I put my book club on hold, skipped my weekly volunteer shifts at the school, rearranged my entire schedule to stay here and look after your wife and unborn baby. I cooked every meal, cleaned this house top to bottom, made sure everything ran smoothly, and this is how I'm repaid? With secret tears and accusations the second your back is turned?" She turned slightly, lifting her chin in quiet indignation. "I came here out of love. If she's upset, that's on her own sensitivity, not on me. I refuse to be villainized for caring too much about my family." Chloe's eyes stung again. It was the same manipulation she'd grown accustomed to over the past 2 weeks. Margaret never did wrong, only cared too deeply. Chloe was never hurt, only overly sensitive. Every boundary, every emotion, every struggle of Chloe's was twisted into ingratitude. She felt smaller by the second, invisible in her own living room. Lucas dragged a hand through his hair, exhaustion settling over him. He'd driven 5 hours straight to get home, ready to rest and reconnect with his wife, and instead he'd walked straight into a household crisis he never saw coming. Part of him still wanted to believe his mother, wanted to hold on to the perfect childhood memory of her selflessness, but the evidence sitting right in front of him was undeniable. Chloe never cried. She avoided conflict, smoothed over tension, apologized for inconveniences that weren't her fault. She did not break down over nothing. "Let's all sit down and talk," Lucas said finally, choosing mediation over confrontation for the moment. He still clung to the faint hope that this was a misunderstanding, that they could clarify boundaries and reset peacefully. The three of them settled into silence in the living room, the atmosphere thick and suffocating. Sunlight streamed through the windows, bright and warm, completely mismatched with the cold tension filling the space. Margaret sat upright and rigid in the armchair, poised and defensive. Chloe remained curled on the couch, her knees drawn slightly inward, still trembling. Lucas sat between them, caught in the middle of the family rift he'd never imagined existing. Margaret spoke first, taking full advantage of the quiet pause. "I think you need to understand, Lucas, that young women today approach pregnancy so recklessly. Chloe's working too much, resting too little, eating inconsistently. I've been trying to correct those bad habits before they hurt the baby. I monitor her screen time because blue light overexposure disrupts rest. I limit her outings because crowded spaces raise infection risk this early in the trimester. None of this is cruelty. This is responsible care." She glanced pointedly at Chloe. She just doesn't have the life experience to see it. Chloe finally found her voice, quiet and shaky, but firm. "I followed my doctor's prenatal plan exactly. I scheduled yoga for pelvic strength. I meal prepped nutrient-dense meals. I limited work hours on my own. You changed all of that without asking me." Margaret waved her off instantly. "Doctors' plans are generic. A mother's intuition is specific. I know what's best for a Bennett baby." Lucas's brow furrowed. For the first time, he heard the arrogance in his mother's tone, the complete dismissal of Chloe's autonomy as the baby's mother. He'd never noticed it before, because he'd never been present to witness it. All his life, he'd only seen his mother's care, never her control. "Mom," he said slowly, "Chloe gets to decide what's best for her body and our baby. You can advise, but you can't override her choices." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, her tone sharpening. "I'm simply protecting my grandchild. If you're going to take her side and dismiss my experience, then I suppose my efforts here are unappreciated." The conversation circled in frustrating loops for the next 20 minutes. Margaret refused to acknowledge any overstep. Chloe refused to back down entirely from the truth, and Lucas struggled to mediate without picking a side. By the end of the talk, no one was satisfied. The tension hadn't lifted. It had only hardened, settling into a permanent weight over the household. Just as Lucas thought they might reach a fragile temporary truce, Margaret delivered the blow that shattered all remaining balance. She stood up, smoothed her blazer once more, and spoke with calm finality. "Since Chloe's clearly struggling to manage on her own, and you're back early to work remotely for the rest of the week, I'll extend my stay through the end of the month. Someone needs to keep this household steady and make sure that baby is properly cared for." Chloe's heart dropped completely. She'd been counting down the hours until Margaret left, clinging to the promise of peace and privacy. Now, even that small hope was stripped away. Lucas froze, realizing in that moment that this was never a temporary misunderstanding. This was a takeover. His mother had no intention of backing down, no interest in respecting their boundaries, and every plan she made was for her own sense of control, not for their family's well-being. The fragile peace he'd tried to salvage was gone entirely. There was no middle ground left to stand on. That night, the house stayed unnaturally quiet. Lucas had retreated to the home office to answer a handful of delayed work emails, but his focus was non-existent. His mind replayed every interaction from the afternoon, every sharp word from his mother, every broken look on Chloe's face. He'd spent his entire adult life believing his family was uniquely harmonious, that they were the kind of close-knit unit other people envied. Now he saw the cracks he'd always ignored, the quiet control he'd mistaken for love. Chloe sat on the edge of their bed long after dark, too anxious to sleep. Her pregnancy nausea lingered, low and constant, and the stress coiled tight in her chest, making every breath feel heavy. She'd always prided herself on being adaptable, on being easy to love and easy to get along with. But 2 weeks of unrelenting judgment had chipped away at her patience. Margaret's announcement that she would stay longer had broken the last of her willingness to endure silently. When Lucas finally returned to the bedroom, he found her staring blankly out the window at the dark suburban street, her hands resting gently on her still flat stomach. The quiet sadness in her expression twisted his heart into knots. "Hey," he said softly, sitting down beside her. "Talk to me, please. Don't keep this from me anymore." Chloe's voice was hoarse when she spoke, stripped of all her usual politeness. "I can't do this anymore, Lucas. I can't keep living in my own house like a guest who's always in the wrong. She controls everything I eat, everything I do, who I talk to. She makes me feel incompetent every single day. I'm pregnant and I should feel safe here. I don't." Her honesty hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, no longer softened by her people-pleasing instincts. Lucas reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together tightly, his grip firm and reassuring. "I had no idea it was this bad," he admitted quietly, guilt heavy in every word. "I thought she was just hovering a little, being overbearing out of excitement. I never knew she was making you miserable every single day. I'm so sorry I left you to deal with this alone." "I didn't tell you," Chloe whispered. "I didn't want you to hate your mom. I didn't want to break your family." Lucas shook his head firmly. "Your peace and our baby's peace come first. Always. My family doesn't get to hurt you and get my loyalty anyway. That's not how this works." The next morning, Chloe woke resolved. She was done hiding, done shrinking, done letting someone else dictate her life and her pregnancy journey. Over breakfast, with Margaret seated across from them at the dining table, Chloe set her first clear, unapologetic boundary. "Mom," she said steadily, meeting Margaret's eyes without hesitation, "I appreciate you wanting to help, but your extended stay isn't working for me. I need privacy in my home, and I need to make my own medical and daily choices for my pregnancy. I'd like you to respect that moving forward." Margaret's fork paused midair, her expression turning icy with offense. She set her silverware down carefully, the clink sharp in the quiet room. "So now you're kicking me out after I've sacrificed weeks of my time to care for you?" she asked, her tone cold and accusatory. "After I've cleaned your home, cooked your meals, and worried day and night about my grandbaby? This is the gratitude I receive?" "It's not about gratitude," Chloe replied, calmer than she felt. "It's about boundaries. This is our home and our pregnancy." Before Margaret could launch into another guilt-laced speech, Lucas spoke up firmly, siding entirely with his wife for the first time in his life. "She's right. Mom, you've overstepped. Chloe's an adult and a mother now. She gets to make her own choices. We appreciate your help, but we don't need you to stay the rest of the month. Your original visit was only supposed to be 2 weeks. It's time for you to go home." Margaret's face flushed with shock and anger. She'd never once heard Lucas speak to her with such firmness, such unyielding resolve. He had always been her obedient, grateful son, always willing to smooth things over, always loyal to her above everyone else. "You're choosing her over me?" she asked, her voice tight with hurt and resentment. "After everything I've done for you your entire life? After I raised you alone through hard years? You're going to cast me aside the second you have a wife." "I'm not casting you aside," Lucas said patiently but firmly. "I'm choosing my immediate family. Chloe and this baby are my priority now. That doesn't erase what you've done for me, but it doesn't give you permission to hurt my wife." The argument escalated quickly, filling the dining room with sharp words and unspoken resentment. Margaret accused Chloe of manipulating Lucas, of poisoning his mind against his own mother, of being greedy and ungrateful. She painted herself as the helpless victim of a cruel, unappreciative household, twisting every boundary into a personal betrayal. By the end of the fight, the air felt fractured beyond easy repair. Margaret refused to apologize, refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, and refused to commit to a departure date. She simply stood up left her half-finished breakfast on the table, and retreated to the guest room, slamming the door firmly behind her. Chloe sank back in her chair, exhausted and emotionally drained, but lighter than she'd been in weeks. She'd finally stood up for herself. She'd finally stopped letting fear of conflict silence her. Lucas reached across the table, covering her hand with his own, his expression serious and determined. "I've got your back from now on. No more hiding. No more letting you fight this alone." But even as Chloe felt relief settle over her, a quiet, lingering dread remained. Margaret had never lost a fight for control in her family before. She wouldn't back down easily. This standoff was only just beginning, and the worst was still ahead of them. The household settled into a cold, tense stalemate after the breakfast confrontation. Margaret stayed secluded in the guest room for most of the morning, emerging only to prepare lunch, her movements quiet and deliberate, her expression carefully neutral. She no longer spoke sharply or openly criticized Chloe, but her passive aggression lingered in every small action. Silent, judgmental glances, exaggerated sighs, leaving rooms the second Chloe entered. Preparing meals she knew Chloe couldn't eat without discomfort. The open cruelty was gone, replaced by a slow, suffocating coldness that was just as isolating. Lucas spent the morning buried in work calls, juggling his remote responsibilities while constantly checking on Chloe, his guilt never far from the surface. He hated the tension in his home, hated that his wife was still suffering, hated that the mother he loved was the source of her pain. Desperate to fix things cleanly without further escalation, he formulated a plan, a private one-on-one conversation with Margaret, man to man, no audience, no defensiveness, just honest dialogue to set clear boundaries and schedule her departure. He pulled Margaret aside after lunch, asking her to step outside onto the back patio to talk privately. Chloe watched them go from the kitchen window, her chest tight with quiet uncertainty. She wanted to trust Lucas completely, wanted to believe he could resolve the conflict peacefully, but weeks of isolation and manipulation had left her wary. She no longer knew what to expect from Margaret, and she feared Lucas's lingering soft spot for his mother would make him too lenient. Outside on the cedar-furnished patio, Lucas spoke gently but firmly. "Mom, I need you to understand where I'm coming from. I love you, and I'm grateful for everything you've done for me, but you crossed major lines with Chloe. She's pregnant, vulnerable, and she's been hurting alone for 2 weeks. I need you to respect our home and our boundaries and leave at the end of your original 2-week stay." Margaret listened quietly, her eyes softening with practiced sorrow, and then she unleashed her carefully crafted guilt trip. She spoke of single-handedly raising Lucas through financial hardship, of sacrificing her youth and social life for his education, of dedicating every year of her life to his success. She framed her overreach as misguided maternal love, her control as protectiveness, her cruelty as concern. "I just didn't want you to struggle the way I did," she told him, her voice thick with emotion. "I wanted your wife and baby to have everything easy. I thought I was helping. I never meant to make anyone miserable. I just cared too deeply." Lucas's resolve wavered, just as Margaret knew it would. The decades of gratitude and childhood loyalty tugged at his heart, softening his firm stance. He began to question himself, wondering if he'd been too harsh, if he'd overreacted to simple overbearing care. Inside the house, Chloe watched the quiet, seemingly calm conversation unfold. She saw her husband's shoulders relax, saw Margaret's sad, pleading expression, and her heart sank. From her perspective, it looked exactly like what she'd always feared. Lucas choosing his mother's feelings over her pain, softening the boundaries they'd fought to set, letting Margaret manipulate her way back into control. By the time Lucas returned inside, his tone was less urgent, less decisive. He found Chloe in the living room, staring blankly out the front window, her posture stiff and withdrawn. "We're good," he said gently. "We talked it out. She understands the boundaries now. She'll be more respectful moving forward." Chloe turned to him, her eyes glistening with quiet disappointment. "That's it? No departure date? No real apology? Just she'll be more respectful?" Lucas frowned, confused by her sharp tone. She admitted she overstepped. "She feels terrible. I think we can give her a little grace." Grace. After 2 weeks of silent suffering, of isolation, of constant judgment that eroded her confidence and peace. Chloe felt utterly unheard. In that moment, the trust she'd had in Lucas's unwavering protection cracked wide open. He'd stood with her once, but now he was back to mediating, back to excusing his mother's harm, back to prioritizing family harmony over her healing. She didn't argue further. She simply nodded, turned away, and retreated to their bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. The quiet distance between them grew thick and uncrossable. Margaret capitalized on the new rift instantly. She resumed her subtle control tactics, quieter now but just as persistent. She continued commenting on Chloe's eating habits, continued hovering over her daily tasks, continued isolating her by intercepting messages and discouraging outside contact. She never fought openly anymore, but she never backed down either. Chloe stopped sharing her feelings with Lucas entirely. She stopped venting, stopped explaining, stopped asking for help. Every time she wanted to point out Margaret's latest overstep, she held her tongue, convinced he would choose his mother's grace over her pain again. She grew increasingly isolated, trapped between an unyielding mother-in-law and a husband who seemed unable to fully protect her. By evening, Chloe sat alone on the balcony as dusk fell, staring out at the darkening suburban sky. A hollow loneliness settling over her. She'd fought for her boundaries, stood up for herself, and still nothing truly changed. As she wrapped her arms around her shoulders against the cool night air, one terrifying thought settled firmly in her mind. She might never be able to build the safe, peaceful family life she'd always dreamed of, not as long as Margaret was in their home, and not as long as Lucas remained unable to see the full truth. The next morning arrived gray and damp, a steady Seattle drizzle streaking down the windows and matching the heavy mood inside the house. The quiet Cold War continued. Margaret moved through the rooms with polite detachment. Lucas walked on eggshells trying to keep the peace, and Chloe remained withdrawn, keeping to herself to avoid further conflict. Chloe had grown exhausted from fighting and failing to be seen. She'd stopped trying to prove her pain to Lucas, convinced he could never fully understand the daily, grinding cruelty of Margaret's passive aggression. He saw only the calm, polite version of his mother she presented when he was watching, the version that brought coffee, tidied the house, and spoke softly. He never saw the sharp comments, the judgmental stares, the isolating control that consumed Chloe's days when he was busy working. Mid-morning, Chloe decided to organize her scattered prenatal files, stacking appointment printouts, vitamin schedules, and doctor notes into a neat folder to avoid misplacing anything important. She carried the small stack of papers and her phone into the quiet home office, settling down at the desk to sort everything methodically. As she shifted her phone to clear space, the voice memo app opened accidentally, displaying a list of unplayed recordings she'd completely forgotten about. During the worst days of Margaret's visit, when she'd been too afraid to vent to anyone out loud, too ashamed to admit how broken she felt, Chloe had recorded quiet voice memos. She'd spoken softly into her phone late at night, whispering the cruel comments Margaret had made, detailing the endless rules and isolation, pouring out the pain she couldn't share with her husband or friends. It had been her only outlet, her only way to process the trauma without breaking her family apart. She stared at the screen for a long moment, her chest tightening. She'd intended to delete them eventually, to bury the worst of those 2 weeks and move on. She never wanted Lucas to hear them, never wanted him to carry the guilt of knowing how badly he'd failed to protect her. Before she could close the app or delete the files, Lucas walked into the office carrying a glass of water for her. He'd noticed her quiet withdrawal all morning and hoped to bridge the growing distance between them. "Hey," he said gently, leaning against the desk. "You've been holed up in here all morning. Need any help organizing stuff?" Chloe's heart raced instantly, panic flaring in her chest. "No, I've got it. I'm almost done." But Lucas's eyes had already fallen to the phone screen, catching the bold text labeled Day 7, Mom's constant criticism. Curiosity got the better of him, amplified by weeks of confusion and unspoken tension. "What are these?" he asked, reaching for the phone before Chloe could stop him. Chloe tried to grab it back, her voice urgent. "Lucas, don't. It's nothing. Just personal notes." But he'd already tapped play. The quiet recording filled the small office instantly. Chloe's shaky, tearful voice echoed through the speakers, recounting Margaret's daily comments word for word, the accusations of laziness, the dismissal of her pregnancy struggles, the insults about her character and mothering potential. Between Chloe's quiet breakdowns, Margaret's sharp, condescending voice cut through clearly, unfiltered and unpolished, nothing like the gentle, caring version Lucas knew. Lucas froze completely, his face draining of all color. He stood motionless, listening to minute after minute of unguarded truth, the reality Chloe had lived alone for 2 full weeks. He heard his mother call his wife immature, ungrateful, unfit for motherhood. He heard her mock Chloe's prenatal choices, dismiss her pain, and boast about how much better she'd handled pregnancy and motherhood decades prior. Most devastating of all, he heard Chloe's quiet, broken whispers between each cruel comment. "I don't know how much longer I can do this. I don't want Lucas to hate his mom. I have to keep going. I have to stay quiet." The memo ended, leaving the office in stunned silence. The drizzle pattered softly against the window, the only sound in the room. Chloe's eyes filled with fresh tears, humiliation and grief washing over her. "I didn't want you to hear those. I didn't want you to feel guilty. I had nowhere else to put it." Lucas set the phone down slowly, his hands trembling slightly. All the small doubts he'd pushed aside, all the excuses he'd made for his mother, all the times he'd thought Chloe was overreacting crumbled completely away. This was not oversensitivity. This was unrelenting, daily emotional abuse, and he had left his vulnerable pregnant wife alone to endure it. He thought back to every nightly text exchange, every reassuring lie Chloe had sent him while he was away. She told him she was fine, that everything was perfect, that his mother was keeping her company. She'd lied to protect him, While she was breaking apart alone in their home, guilt crashed over him in crushing waves, heavy and unescapable. He'd been so focused on preserving his perfect family image, so desperate to avoid conflict, that he'd blinded himself to his wife's suffering. He'd chosen comfort over clarity, peace over truth, and cost Chloe dearly for it. I had no idea, he whispered hoarsely, his voice thick with regret. I genuinely had no clue how bad it was. I'm so sorry, Chloe. I'm so fucking sorry I left you alone in this. Chloe looked up at him, her eyes red and tired, every ounce of her earlier resentment softening into sorrow. She wasn't angry anymore. She was just sad. Sad that he'd never seen her pain without proof. Sad that their perfect home had fractured so irreparably. Sad that innocence and peace were gone for good. Lucas picked up the phone again, scrolling through the long list of unplayed memos, realizing there were weeks of hidden pain he'd never once suspected. In that moment, his childhood idealization of his mother shattered completely. He no longer saw a selfless, perfect parent. He saw a flawed, controlling woman who loved fiercely but selfishly, who prioritized her own sense of control over the well-being of his marriage and his child. He knew then that gentle mediation, soft conversations, and endless grace would never fix this. Margaret was not going to change, not going to back down, not going to respect their boundaries voluntarily. For the first time, Lucas understood exactly what he had to do, and he knew it would cost him dearly. Lucas did not hesitate any longer. He walked straight out of the home office, phone in hand, and found Margaret in the kitchen, calmly folding laundry on the counter like she had not spent weeks systematically breaking down his wife's confidence and peace. The normalcy of her routine made his blood run cold. He stood in the kitchen doorway, his posture rigid and unyielding, no longer tentative, no longer pleading for peace. The gentle son who'd always softened for his mother was gone, replaced by a husband ready to defend his family at all costs. We need to talk. Now. Margaret looked up from the laundry, her expression calm and unconcerned, accustomed to diffusing his minor frustrations with charm and guilt. What is it, Lucas? I'm just tidying up the house for you two. Lucas held up his phone, the screen displaying the list of voice memos. I heard them. Every word. Every comment you made to Chloe while I was gone. Every time you criticized her, isolated her, made her small and unworthy in her own home. Margaret's composure faltered for the first time all week, her hands stilled on the folded towels, her smile dropping completely. For a split second, the practiced mask fell away, revealing pure, unguarded panic, but she recovered quickly, slipping back into her victim persona without skipping a beat. She set down the laundry, lifted her chin, and let out a quiet, disappointed sigh. So she's been recording me now, secretly gathering evidence to turn my own son against me. That's manipulative, Lucas. That's not healthy behavior. That's proof of how unstable her emotional state is right now. Lucas stared at her in disbelief, stunned by her refusal to take any accountability whatsoever. It's not manipulative to document abuse when you have no one to trust. She had no one to tell because you isolated her. She had no proof of what she was going through until now. Abuse. Margaret repeated the word like it was obscene, her voice sharpening with indignation. I was caring for her. I was protecting my grandbaby. If she felt uncomfortable, it was because she's incapable of accepting constructive feedback. I have spent my entire life caring for other people, and I will not be labeled abusive for having standards. Your standards hurt her, Lucas shot back firmly. Your standards made my pregnant wife cry alone every night for 2 weeks. Your standards broke her confidence and made her afraid in her own home. That's not care, Mom. That's control. Margaret's eyes turned cold, her patience evaporating entirely. She no longer bothered with softness or pretense. I see now. You've completely turned against me. You've chosen your wife over the woman who gave you everything. Fine. But don't forget who supported you through college, who paid for your first car, who helped you put the down payment on this house. Every comfort you have right now came from me. If you're going to treat me like an enemy, I can easily withdraw that support. The threat hung heavy in the kitchen air, sharp and unmissable. Margaret was willing to weaponize financial security to maintain control, willing to destabilize her son's family to preserve her own pride. Lucas felt the weight of the threat settle over him, but he did not flinch. For the first time in his life, family loyalty was not his default. I don't care about the money or the support. I care about my wife and my baby. You can take every single thing back if you want. I will not let you hurt my family anymore. The fight drained every last bit of energy from the household. By the time Lucas returned to the bedroom to find Chloe, his shoulders were heavy with exhaustion, his heart sore from the irreversible rift with his mother. Chloe was sitting on the bed, her knees pulled to her chest, her face pale and defeated. The stress of the confrontation, the weight of weeks of trauma, and the fear of an uncertain future had pushed her to her absolute breaking point. Her pregnancy nausea spiked sharply, her hands trembling uncontrollably, and for a terrifying moment, she felt completely overwhelmed. Unsure if she could endure more conflict. I don't know if I can do this anymore, she whispered brokenly. I don't want to spend my pregnancy fighting. I don't want my baby to grow up in a house full of tension and anger. I'm so tired, Lucas. I'm so tired of trying and failing and hurting. Lucas sat beside her, pulling her gently into his arms, holding her tightly like he could shield her from every harm. He pressed his forehead to hers, his voice steady and resolute, no longer hesitant, no longer conflicted. "I'm so sorry I let it get this far. I'm so sorry I didn't protect you sooner. But it's over now. No more mediation. No more giving chances. No more letting her get away with hurting you. I choose you. I choose our baby. I choose our peace. No matter what it costs me." Chloe clung to him, tears flowing freely, releasing weeks of pent-up pain and fear. For the first time since Margaret arrived, she did not feel alone. She did not feel invisible. She felt loved, defended, and seen. But even as relief washed over her, she knew the worst of the conflict was not yet finished. Margaret had lost her gentle hold on the family, but she was far from defeated. She was angry, bitter, and ready to fight to regain control, and she would not go down without a final, devastating standoff. Lucas abandoned all attempts at emotional negotiation after the explosive kitchen fight. He understood now that Margaret thrived on guilt, on drama, on emotional leverage. Every time he softened, every time he pleaded, every time he tried to preserve their bond, she took it as weakness and pushed further. To win back their home and their peace, he needed to stop fighting with feeling and start acting with unwavering, unemotional resolve. He spent the morning drafting clear, non-negotiable household boundaries, writing them out plainly so there was no room for twisting, misunderstanding, or manipulation. He did not frame them as requests or suggestions. He framed them as rules for his home, his wife, his unborn child. When Margaret emerged from her room mid-morning, still carrying the cold fury of their previous fight, Lucas sat her down at the dining table and laid out the new terms without hesitation. "These are the new boundaries for your remaining time in our home," he said evenly, sliding the typed list across the table. "First, no unsolicited pregnancy advice, no criticism of Chloe's diet, work schedule, or medical choices. Second, no monitoring of her phone, no intercepting calls, no interfering with her social plans. Third, no commenting on her mood, her energy levels, or her choices as a mother. Fourth, you will respect our privacy at all times. Fifth, your final departure date is set for this Friday. No extensions, no exceptions." Margaret stared at the paper like it was a personal insult, her jaw tightening with suppressed rage. "You're giving me rules in my own son's home? This is my home," Lucas corrected firmly. "I bought it with my income. I built this life for my wife and child. You are a guest here, and you will respect our household rules." Margaret tried her usual tactics: guilt-tripping, victimhood, accusations of ingratitude. But Lucas was completely immune now. He listened quietly, nodded when she finished speaking, and repeated the same firm boundary without emotion. He did not argue, did not defend, did not apologize. He simply held the line, unshakable. Without emotional fuel to feed her drama, Margaret's tactics fell flat. Her guilt trips no longer landed. Her accusations no longer sparked conflict. Her manipulation no longer worked. For the first time in decades, she had no power over her son. Watching Lucas stand firm reignited Chloe's own courage. After days of withdrawal and isolation, she stepped back into her life boldly. She texted her best friend to reschedule their coffee date, rebooked her canceled prenatal yoga classes, and resumed her freelance work without hiding or limiting herself for Margaret's benefit. She walked through her home with quiet confidence, no longer shrinking, no longer apologizing for existing. She ate the meals she craved, took the rest she needed, and spoke up immediately whenever Margaret attempted a subtle jab. The fear that had controlled her for weeks melted away, replaced by quiet strength. The power dynamic in the household shifted completely. Where Chloe had once been the hunted, quiet, and afraid, Margaret now walked on eggshells, bitter and powerless. She resented the sudden loss of control, hated being relegated to guest status in the home she'd once dominated entirely. By afternoon, Margaret's frustration was palpable. She moved through the house stiffly, silent and seething, unable to find any opening to regain her hold. Every small attempt at interference was shut down instantly by Lucas's calm, unyielding boundaries. Every passive-aggressive comment was met with Chloe's quiet, confident refusal to engage. Lucas watched his wife bloom again, watched the light return to her eyes, watched her relax in her own home for the first time in 2 weeks. Relief and pride swelled in his chest, solidifying his resolve to protect her always. As evening fell, and the quiet household settled into peaceful routine, Margaret sat alone in the guest room, plotting her final move. She had lost daily control of the household, lost her power over Lucas's emotions, lost her ability to manipulate Chloe into silence. But she still had one final, devastating card left to play. She would not leave quietly. She would not accept defeat gracefully. She would make sure Lucas and Chloe understood exactly what they'd sacrificed to gain their peace. Thursday arrived as the final full day of Margaret's stay, and the house remained eerily calm. The daily conflict was gone, replaced by a heavy, waiting silence. No one fought, no one argued, no one sniped, but no one relaxed relaxed either. Everyone knew the final confrontation was looming, waiting just beneath the surface of the quiet days. Lucas formalized every boundary that morning, clarifying not just Margaret's final days in the home, but the future of their entire family dynamic. He sat down with both Chloe and Margaret and laid out permanent rules for all future visits, holidays, and interactions. Moving forward, he said clearly, all visits will be pre-planned, temporary and respectful of our privacy. No unannounced stays, no unsolicited interference, no judgment of our parenting or household choices. If you cannot respect these boundaries, you will not be invited into our home. Margaret's expression turned stone cold. She'd spent a lifetime assuming unlimited access to her son's life, assuming her opinions would always be prioritized, assuming her control would never be challenged. These permanent boundaries felt like a permanent rejection. So this is it? She asked sharply. After I raised you, after I sacrificed everything for you, you're going to lock me out of your life? You're going to choose this woman over your own mother forever? This is not locking you out, Lucas replied steadily. This is creating healthy boundaries. I love you, Mom, but I will not let you harm my family anymore. Love does not require unlimited access or control. Margaret refused to accept the distinction. In her mind, boundary equaled betrayal. Distance equaled abandonment. She lifted her chin and delivered her final, unbreakable ultimatum. Fine. If this is the family you want, one that shuts out its own matriarch, one that rejects my love and guidance, then I will not participate in it. I will not attend your baby's birth. I will not attend birthdays, holidays, or family gatherings. If I am not welcome in your home fully and freely, I will not come at all. The words landed like a heavy blow. Chloe's breath caught in her throat. She had never wanted to destroy a family, never wanted to strip a grandparent from her child's life. She'd only ever wanted safety and respect. But Margaret was forcing an all-or-nothing choice, total control or complete absence. Lucas did not flinch. That is your choice to make, but we will not sacrifice our peace to keep you comfortable. Later that afternoon, Lucas spoke privately with his distant cousin, who'd known Margaret their entire life. His cousin's confirmation validated everything Chloe had endured, revealing that Margaret had always controlled Lucas's relationships, had always manipulated situations to keep him dependent on her approval. She had pushed away every serious girlfriend Lucas had ever had before Chloe, always finding fault, always creating conflict, always positioning herself as the only loyal, loving family member. The confirmation erased the last of Lucas's lingering guilt. He was not betraying his mother. He was finally breaking free of a lifelong pattern of control. That night, Chloe and Lucas lay awake in bed long after dark, processing the weight of everything that had happened. They talked openly and honestly for hours, repairing the small trust rifts that had formed during the weeks of conflict, sharing their fears and their hopes for the future. I hate that it had to be this hard, Chloe whispered, resting her head on Lucas's chest. I hate that our baby might grow up with distance from their grandma. Lucas held her tighter, pressing a soft kiss to her hair. I hate it too. But I'd rather have peace with a little distance than constant chaos and fear. Our family's health matters more than perfect holiday gatherings. They both knew the truth. There would be no easy reconciliation. There would be no heartfelt apology from Margaret. No sudden change of heart. No return to the warm, harmonious family dynamic of Lucas's childhood. Too much damage had been done. Too many truths had been exposed. By the time morning arrived, they were both resolute. They were ready for the final showdown. They were ready to choose their new, peaceful family life, even if it came with bittersweet loss. Friday morning dawned bright and clear, the Seattle sun breaking through the usual cloud cover, a quiet contrast to the storm brewing inside the household. It was Margaret's scheduled departure day, and the entire house felt the weight of the final goodbye. Margaret packed her suitcase slowly, deliberately, dragging out every moment, refusing to leave without one final attempt to shift blame, to elicit guilt, to reclaim victory. She moved through the guest room with quiet dignity, but her eyes remained sharp and resentful, her mind fixed on one last manipulation. When her suitcase was fully packed and zipped, she walked into the living room where Lucas and Chloe waited together, sitting side by side on the couch, united and steady. They were no longer fractured, no longer conflicted, no longer caught in the middle. They were a solid front, a family choosing their own peace. Margaret stopped in front of them, her voice steady and solemn, designed to evoke maximum guilt. I'm leaving now. I hope you're both happy with the family you've created. A family that casts aside the woman who built its foundation, that rejects love because it's not perfect enough, that trades lifelong loyalty for temporary comfort. She looked directly at Lucas, her eyes glistening with performative sorrow. I raised you to be grateful, respectful, loyal. I never thought I'd watch you throw all of that away for a few simple boundaries. I never thought I'd be pushed out of my own son's life. For a long moment, the room was silent. Chloe tensed slightly, waiting for Lucas to waver, waiting for him to soften and apologize. But he did not. Lucas stood slowly, facing his mother with calm, unshakable clarity. This isn't about throwing you away. This is about stopping harm. I am grateful for everything you sacrificed for me growing up. I will always be thankful for the life you gave me. But gratitude does not mean I have to let you hurt my wife or my child." His voice was firm but gentle. No anger, no resentment, only unwavering truth. "You crossed lines you had no right to cross. You isolated Chloe, criticized her endlessly, made her miserable in her own home, and you refused to apologize for any of it. I can't reward that behavior with unlimited access to our family." Margaret's lips tightened. "I was only protecting you." "Protecting me is not controlling my family," Lucas replied. "Protecting me is loving me enough to respect the life I've built. You've never been able to do that." In that moment, Chloe found her own voice, steady and unafraid, no longer ashamed to speak her truth. "I never wanted to fight with you. I never wanted to separate your family. All I ever wanted was to be respected in my own home, to have my pregnancy choices honored, to feel safe and peaceful while I carry your grandchild. I stayed silent for weeks to preserve your family's harmony, and I suffered alone for it. I don't deserve that, and my baby doesn't deserve that." Margaret stared at them both, her mask finally falling completely. No more sorrow, no more victimhood. No more gentle concern. Only bitter, unyielding pride remained. "I see now that nothing I do will ever be good enough for either of you," she said coldly. "Fine, I'll go. But don't expect me to beg for a place in your lives. Don't expect me to celebrate your baby, or comfort you in hard times, or show up for your family. You've made your choice. Now you live with it." She grabbed her suitcase handle, turned on her heel, and walked toward the front door without a single backward glance. Lucas followed her to the entryway, his heart heavy but resolute. He opened the door for her, the bright morning sunlight flooding into the dark hallway. Margaret stepped across the threshold, paused for one final second, and tossed one last cutting remark over her shoulder. "Enjoy your perfect little life. I hope it's worth everything you've lost." The front door clicked shut softly behind her. The house went completely silent. After weeks of endless tension, constant conflict, and suffocating control, the weight was suddenly, miraculously gone. Lucas stood frozen in the entryway, processing the irreversible choice he'd just made. Chloe remained on the couch, her hands trembling, her heart full of bittersweet relief. Their peaceful home was finally theirs again, but their family would never be whole in the way they'd once hoped. The days following Margaret's departure unfolded with quiet, gentle peace. The oppressive tension that had hung over the house for weeks slowly lifted, dissipating room by room, hour by hour. The silence was no longer heavy with unspoken conflict. It was soft, calm, and safe. The kind of silence Chloe had spent 2 years dreaming of. Chloe's physical and emotional health improved almost immediately. Her constant pregnancy nausea faded, her persistent fatigue eased, and the quiet anxiety that had lived in her chest for weeks finally dissolved. She slept deeply through the night for the first time since Margaret had arrived, waking rested and calm each morning. She reconnected with her friends, returned to her prenatal yoga classes, and resumed her gentle freelance work routine without fear of judgment or interference. Lucas settled back into his work rhythm, lighter and more present than he'd been in months. He no longer carried the quiet guilt of ignoring his wife's suffering, no longer juggled loyalty between two conflicting family bonds. He focused entirely on loving and supporting Chloe, on preparing their home for their baby's arrival, on nurturing their marital bond after the strain of conflict. They spent their evenings together in quiet domestic joy, assembling the white wooden crib in the spare bedroom, folding tiny neutral baby clothes, researching gentle parenting resources, painting the nursery walls a soft, warm sage green. Every small, ordinary task felt precious after weeks of chaos and pain. They talked openly and honestly about the trauma they'd endured, processing the conflict together, instead of letting it sit unspoken between them. They apologized to each other for their missteps, Chloe for staying silent too long, for letting fear of conflict make her hide her pain, Lucas for being willfully naive, for prioritizing peace over truth, for leaving her to suffer alone. Their marriage did not emerge from the conflict unchanged. It was stronger, deeper, more honest. They no longer avoided hard conversations, no longer prioritized surface harmony over genuine emotional safety. They learned the most important lesson of their young family. Peace without boundaries is never real peace. Margaret stayed true to her ultimatum in the weeks that followed. She sent no texts, made no calls, offered no well wishes. There was no dramatic retaliation, no financial punishment, no public fallout, only quiet, cold distance. She removed herself entirely from their lives, leaving the space empty for the first time in Lucas's adulthood. At first, the absence felt lonely. Lucas grieved the warm, perfect mother he'd believed in his whole life. He grieved the harmonious family holidays he'd always imagined, the grandparent bond he'd hoped his child would have. But as the weeks passed, grief softened into acceptance. He realized he wasn't losing a family. He was gaining a healthy one. He wasn't abandoning his mother. He was finally loving his wife and child the way they deserved to be loved. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, a month after Margaret left, Chloe and Lucas stood together in the finished nursery, staring at the empty crib. Sunlight spilling through the window over the fresh paint and stacked baby blankets. Chloe rested her hand on her now rounded stomach, feeling the faint flutter of movement beneath her palm. "We did it," she said softly, her voice warm and steady. Lucas wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close, his chin resting gently on her shoulder. "We did. We finally have our home back. Our real home. There would be no perfect, unbroken family. There would be no fairy tale reconciliation, no sudden change of heart from Margaret, no effortless harmony. Their family would have scars. It would have distance. It would have hard-won boundaries and honest, imperfect love. But it would be safe. It would be kind. It would be theirs." As they stood together in the quiet room, waiting for their baby to arrive, they both understood. The greatest family blessing wasn't a life without conflict. It was building a life where they could protect each other, choose each other, and grow stronger together through every storm.